Yes, my name is Corey O'Soup. I'm from the Key First Nation in Saskatchewan, Canada, and I'm the advocate for children and youth for the province of Saskatchewan.
Now, you actually made some history in that appointment in 2016. What was that?
Yes, in our province of Saskatchewan, I'm the very first Indigenous person to ever hold the role in our province, and actually across Canada in all of our advocates' offices. I'm the third Indigenous person in the history of Canada to hold this type of role within our province as an independent officer of the legislature responsible for the safety and protection of children and youth.
Fantastic, thank you for that. On your first day at work, you said there was some big news, not tragically unusual, but this time it gained some momentum. Can you say what happened?
Yeah, fortunately or unfortunately, on my first day of work in the previous month of October, I started on November 1st of 2016, 6 young Indigenous girls between the ages of 11 and 14 died by suicide in the northern half of our province. And I think it was probably the only time that our government agreed on something. Both the leader of the opposition and our premier agreed that they would ask me to look into the situation. And it was at that point where we decided as an office that we would do an independent investigation into the issue of Indigenous youth suicide in northern Saskatchewan.
Now, you sought to do that differently. Why was that, and can you say in what way?
You know, we did some research initially before we started on the project, and we found that there was some amazing work out there, of course, to give credit to all the people that are doing work on the topic of Indigenous youth suicide from all over the world, provincially, nationally, internationally, but we found that there was a gap in the research. And the gap that we found was that not too many folks were talking to young people and engaging in young people and asking them for their voice. And I'm not saying that nobody did, but I'll say that we couldn't find one entire report that was dedicated entirely to youth voice and to giving them an entire report that they would be able to speak their mind and their hearts about what it's like to be a young person today and facing the difficult issue of youth suicide.
So you've got that report with you. Can you just give us a bit of a look at it and describe really what's different about it? Because it's very different in format to most of the reports, the dusty tomes we get.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, like the size, I can start with the size. It's the size of a record, of a vinyl or an LP, whatever you want to call it. This was inspired by Gord Downey of the Tragically Hip of the size. He's done a book called The Secret Path, and we wanted to kind of honor him with that because he's passed now. But it's also the size is you can't put it on your bookshelf, and you can't, hide it somewhere because it stands out. If it's on your bookshelf, there's this odd book sticking out. If you have it on your desk, there's this big square sitting there under a bunch of papers or on top, so we decided really to try and do that with just the size of it. But even the title, the title is Shhh Listen, we have something to say, Youth Voices of the North, and that's a challenge to us as adults to really close our mouths because we really like to talk a lot and really to open our ears and open our hearts to what the young people have to say to us, and once we do that, and if we're able to do that, and if we're able to give our young people a platform, they will truly amaze you. They will inspire you. They will show you how smart they are. They will show you how it is and what it's like to be a young person today in this world. And I'll tell you this, it's a lot different than when we were young people. When we were young people, the world was a different place. And, topics like mental health and suicide were something that were slid under the carpet or had a huge stigma around it, and we didn't talk about it. And now it's become so prevalent that I believe, as the advocate for children and youth, that the topics of mental health and suicide are probably the number one issue facing young people today, not just in Saskatchewan and Canada, and I've traveled all over the world. I believe it's the number one issue facing our young people in the world today. And I believe that the solutions aren't going to come from people like me. They're not going to come from our politicians, our governments. They're not going to come from the adults in the room. They're going to come from our young people because they are the ones that know what it's like. They are the ones that know what's going on in their head. They're the ones that can create the solutions. And that's what this book is all about. It gives the young people a voice. And with that voice, of course, they told us why, but more importantly, they gave us solutions to the difficult topic of youth suicide.
So what were some of those solutions that you don't think you would have unearthed by a more traditional investigation?
Well, one of the themes that we talked about in here was bullying and cyberbullying, and that came from the young people. Not something that would, really surprise anybody out there, or it's something that, oh, gee, this is really groundbreaking. Our kids are getting bullied, But the way that they talked about it, and some of the things within that topic of bullying, are things that we didn't hear before, or that we didn't want to hear before. Like bullying is becoming increasingly violent. When we were kids, as adults, if somebody shoved you into the locker or stole your shoes or whatever, that was the end of it, right? Or you might get in a fight on the playground. But nowadays, kids are literally scared for their lives. The violence and the aggressiveness of bullies has changed to the point where kids do not want to walk down their streets. They don't want to walk into their schools. They're literally scared to end up in the hospital, and they're literally scared to end up dead. And those are things that we didn't have to deal with as young people. And the other thing here is, as an adult, when I was a young person, I could leave bullying at the playground, or I could leave it in the school, and I'd go home and I'd be in a pretty relatively safe situation where, the bullying would stop. Nowadays, kids have phones, they have social media, where the bullying is 24/7. It's non-stop for our young people, and I don't think we've totally recognized the impact that has on the lives of our kids and on the lives of our families. And the last thing on that one topic and one example is around who's bullying who. We create programs for kids bullying kids, and anti-bullying this and stop bullying, and we've seen it all. But what we haven't done is we haven't created programs for adults that are bullying kids. And as a parent and as a professional and as the advocate, I had to kind of take a step back, because the young people in this book are calling us out as professionals. They mention teachers, they mention police officers, they mention parents in this book as active participants in bullying that leads them down the path of suicide.
In what way do parents?
As an adult, I'll say as a parent, my system is set up as a parent to bully my children, because I'm the boss, I'm the leader, I hold all the knowledge. What I say, you must do, right? And that's the way I was brought up. I was brought up in this family that, if I didn't do something, I was disciplined, and disciplined in many different ways, a strap, a belt, so many different ways like that. Those are different types of bullying, right? Do we ever sit down and ask our children, why are you behaving like that? Or do we just say stop and don't do it? And when we just say stop and don't do it without having that conversation, we're actively participating in bullying. Yes, they may need to stop that behavior, and they may need to, don't do it anymore, but we need to have that further conversation. So we're not just bullies, as parents and as adults, so those are different types of situations. And there are even more extreme situations than me, because I think that I had a pretty good childhood, and I also thought I was a pretty good dad. But there are other children in more vulnerable situations than me, where there are beatings taking place, where there are kids losing their lives at the hands of people that they are supposed to be able to trust. Their parents, their aunts, their uncles, those that are closest to them. And that is a form of bullying which leads our kids down the path of suicide.
We've also heard a lot at the conference about structural violence, the state as a very bad parent, but also the state's role in so much discrimination, impoverishment, etc., which is also related to Indigenous suicide rates. What traction have you got from this report? Has the legislature jumped into action as a result?
There are numerous, examples of systemic racism, systemic violence, systemic issues within our government, our provincial one, our national one, and around the world, and we've actually gotten some traction out of this. Our legislature whom I'm an independent officer of, has accepted all of the recommendations within it. Now, accepting those, well, we call them calls to action, accepting those and doing something about them are a different story, and they're not the only ones that are called to action in this. Our parents are called, our friends are called, our community leaders are called to action, but also our government is called to action. And I believe that's where I step in, and it's my job to hold them to account on this. So, in Saskatchewan, there's one, one specific example where they've actually invested money into some of the recommendations that we've made. There's a program called Mental Health Capacity Building in Schools Initiative, where we pull in some of the professionals that might only be out in the community, like psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health nurses, different supports, and we pull those folks into the school system where the kids are. And we learned of this from another province in Canada, and our government actually, after us advocating for about a year, decided to invest $1.2 million into this program to run 5 pilots across our province, and those are starting in January of 2019. So I will give them some kudos there, but as far as the entire report, I believe there is so much more that needs to be done by our governments, by the systems that are in place within our governments, but they're not the only one that is responsible for this. That's you and I.
And community-driven solutions are a big focus here. What did you find anything happening in the communities there that you would want to see spread out across the province, but also perhaps globally?
Yeah, exactly. Within our First Nations, I'll say specifically, they've created a First Nations suicide prevention strategy, and I call for the government to support that. Now, this strategy was created by First Nations for First Nations communities, and our First Nations traveled across the province to all of our First Nations, our First Nation organization, provincial one, and they interviewed and they checked and they came up with this entire strategy. Now, the challenge there to our government is are you going to keep telling us what to do? Are you going to support and invest in us and the solutions that we've created ourselves within our community? Now, that's the stage we're at with, say, that one example. Now, the challenge for them is, okay, well, how do we let go? How do we not continue to be paternalistic in our views, in our actions, and how do we let go? And that's part of my job, is to challenge them to let go, to let them know that we as Indigenous people have the ability, we have the knowledge, we have the experience, we have the letters behind our name, like the PhDs, the MSWs, the BSWs, the BEDs. We have all of those letters, from our universities, and we have the capability. But even more importantly, what my message is to them is we have the inherent right that we never gave up throughout history to discipline, to teach, to educate, to provide for our own children. Sometimes they just need to get out of the way and support us as we do that. And that's what I challenge our government to do.
Thank you very much for the time, Corey.
Yes, thank you for